So first, let me introduce Fernette. Dr. Fernette is a neurologist, and together with her husband runs a very well-known clinical practice dedicated to children with learning disabilities, and in particular reading disabilities. So they are located in Washington, near Seattle, and I'm sorry, I was going to keep a copy of the bio for myself so I can read off of it, and then I gave all of my copies away, so I'm trying to think about it from memory. But she's been on faculty at UC Chicago. She did her medical training at UCSF here, residency at UCSF here, and everyone flies in from around the country and sometimes internationally. I don't know what the proportion is, but to come and see Dr. ID. So I'm very pleased to have her as our first speaker.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Famiko. I wanted to also tell you that I did load these slides. There's a few tweaks difference in slideshare.net, too, that you can download if you'd like. All right, so this is the pointer. These are disclosures. Do I have to mention them? No?
I guess verbally.
Okay, so our books are The Mislabeled Child and The Dyslexic Advantage. We're on the professional advisory boards of STEM, Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted. So the prevalence of LD and ADHD is quite high, as most of you in the room are aware of. Prevalence of learning disabilities is estimated to be 5 to 20% of American children. In ADHD is estimated to be about 10%. There are various definitions of learning disabilities. The NINDS focuses on ability to understand or use spoken or written language, ability to do mathematical calculations, coordinate movements, or direct attention. The AACAP focuses on reading, math, and writing skills that are substantially below that expected of age, schooling, and level of intelligence. And the IDEA 2004 statement and renewal also added that it must not require the use of a severe discrepancy between intellectual ability, usually that means IQ testing, and achievement to determine whether there's a specific learning disability. These kind of different definitions can create some confusion within educational and medical circles, so it's good to be aware of. But the idea of the IDEA ruling is to increase the number of students that might qualify. So there's a high prevalence of comorbidity between learning disabilities and ADHD. I've got the entire chart here from this pediatrics article, but learning disabilities are found in 46% of children that are presenting with ADHD, higher than conduct disorder, anxiety, and depression. There are higher rates of depression and anxiety that are found among children and adolescents with LD. In studies of LD and anxiety, some 9 to 20% of students with LD are found to have anxiety. And in terms of depression, also higher rates. I found this interesting. In one study that looked at different ages, 13% of 7-year-olds with learning disability were found to have depression, and 7% of 10-year-olds. In the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center study of successfully completed suicides, 50% of suicides of children younger than age 15 were found to have learning disabilities. So it's powerful. It's just a devastating condition. There's a high prevalence of unrecognized learning disabilities as well. There was a Colorado study that went about testing 399, I don't know why they didn't do 400, 399 children that came into their outpatient clinic. And when they did a chart review, 28% had previous learning disabilities, and they found by testing another 25%. So it's half the clinic that comes in through your doors. In terms of the different types, reading disability is anywhere from 5 to 17.5%. Math disability is 5 to 8%. Writing disability, 5 to 20%. U.S. Department of Education says there are 2.8 million children with specific learning disabilities. And I found this statistic striking, too. 21 to 23% of the adult U.S. population can read a little, but not enough to fill out an application or read a food label. So what I'm going to do is do a quick skip over wide categories with the idea the experts on the panel are going to drill down. I'm going to be talking very briefly about genetics of learning disabilities and ADHD, talk about neuropsychological overlaps between LD and ADHD, and get into the neurobiological bases. For the most part, using the advances in functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, what they tell us. My role and my husband's role, we're clinicians, and so mainly what I'm doing is culling some really fascinating research work that helps inform some of the observations that we make in the clinic. And finally, discuss briefly some of the unresolved issues and individual factors that influence phenotype, how kids present. Okay, in terms of genetic studies, there are these twin studies, and there was initial enthusiasm that there would be some genes identified that were really critical for these various different learning disabilities. And despite this fairly dramatic twin results with monozygotes and dizygotes, 60% with reading disability, 66%, 35% for dizygotic twins. And here we go, ADHD, 68, 24, math disability, 40%, 24%. Thus far, using molecular genetics, the candidate genes, and DNA polymorphism approaches, it looks like these reading disability, math disability, and ADHD are affected by multiple genes with small effect sizes. When neuropsychologists were trying to see if they could delineate these different categories of ADHD, reading disorder, and then ADHD plus reading disorder, surprisingly frustrating using certain tests to identify which is reading disorder and which is ADHD. What I'll show you later on in the talk is that there really is a lot of evidence distinguishing these on the basis of brain functional magnetic resonance imaging, but neuropsychological testing is difficult in sorting these out. On a test of phonemic deletion, which a lot of people regard as the hallmark of reading disability, the ability to sort out different sounds and decode them for the process of reading. If we look at the far left category, this light brown, it's controls, ADHD, reading disorder, and ADHD plus reading disorder. Certainly the reading disorder ones are more marked in phonemic deletion. But if you look at things like spelling, they're very much in the same direction. ADHD students in general will have score lower on spelling. If you look at Stroop color, which some use for attention, reading disability is certainly impaired. Same with verbal working memory. Affects reading disability really fairly equally with ADHD. If you look at other tests, the WISC coding, which is a task, it basically correlates with copying from the board. They have a number of symbols that students are supposed to copy accurately in a certain amount of time. ADHD students and reading disorder students are really very similar. You look on the symbol search, some dyslexics, for instance, might miss a symbol search because of reversals, but if you're inattentive to it, it's hard to sort it out as well. So there's really not a pathognomonic pattern that looks like for neuropsychological testing. This is Wisconsin Card Sort and the CPT Commission Continuous Performance Task Commission errors. Common errors are made with reading disability as well as ADHD. So a huge advance has been, and our understanding of learning disorders has come from this functional MRI technique. Many of you know a lot about this, but for those who don't, it's looking at blood flow and oxygenation and looking at often different tasks, or in some cases in the rest state, what differences can be seen. And for normal reading, it's become clear that this kind of left hemispheric pathway is very important. It's another factor looking to the right, but for simple presentation purposes here, there's some component of parts of the brain that are important for visual inputs and a visual word form area. There's also the area that's important for pronunciation and articulation and access to meaning. And this kind of sweep along the left hemisphere can be seen when you look at reading comprehension compared to listening comprehension. With the initial studies in dyslexia, there was some enthusiasm. It might be a simple story, but it's not quite a simple story. This is a study from 2003 where it looked fairly straightforward. If you had control and dyslexic students, when they were reading rhyming letters like B and T or D and T, that there wasn't any signal present, and then you did some remediation, and then these signals appeared following the treatment intervention. But the truth is that it's not a simple matter when it comes to dyslexia. That's at least the case I'm going to present to you. There are a lot of different features of auditory processing that have been found among dyslexics, and it's helpful to know these things because often your patients will tell you of these kinds of problems. For example, this study was looking at the processing of rapid sounds, and dyslexics, usually when we present dyslexic groups, it's usually the average of anywhere from a dozen to more study subjects. So a lot less activity here with rapid greater than slow sounds. Here, tests of phonemic working memory. This might be things like trying to remember ba, la, da, ga in certain order. There's a lot more activity in controls compared to dyslexics. And even in tests of auditory brainstem responses, trying to hear a particular sound over background noise is much poorer in poor readers compared to good readers. And this correlates in the clinic with difficulties besides reading, with listening over background noise, note-taking, foreign language. Very hard to actually hear some of the subtle sounds that are present when learning a foreign language. But there's also a significant visual component to dyslexia too. This is an oldish study, but when there's so much attention on phonics and auditory processing, the visual piece also can get neglected. And I wanted to show this. If you look at the controls across the top and dyslexia in the second row, if you flash a visual pattern, controls and dyslexics see it. I mean, it looks a very similar pattern. However, if you move the pattern, that's where the signal is decreased among dyslexics. And there are different theories about why this might be. This is kind of an interesting possibility. There seems to be a slower visual blink in dyslexics. And what the visual blink is if you present a visual stimulus, normally, all of us won't be able to see it if the second stimulus is close to the first stimulus. And so what that means is that the fact that with dyslexics, because it's slower, they can't actually see a rapid visual presentation that follows. And that might affect, for instance, when you're reading. You can't read that fast because you can't take in the change that's coming with the letters. There have been other data that is welcome to see in the research area because patients have told us, we tend to see families, so adults often tell us about their issues as well as the children. We set up our clinic so that we can talk to the parents in detail. And this is something that we've noticed too, is that a number of dyslexics say that it's much easier to read when the font is spaced out more. And there are research studies to support this. There's also a motor component to dyslexia as well. And in general, as a group, dyslexics are found to have slower response times and less automatic learning. For some of you who may be familiar with this serial motor response task, there's a visual cue, and the study subjects are supposed to tap a button in time with a visual presentation of stimuli. What they do is they present a pattern, and then suddenly they present a random pattern, and if you've mastered the pattern, it kind of fakes you out, and you get a slower response time. That's a normal pattern that shows that you implicitly learned the motor pattern. Well, with dyslexics, there's not that delay, and so the conclusion of the study, which is likely in our opinion, is that dyslexics as a group have a harder time learning these implicit tasks. This would affect, for instance, things like learning your letters. There's a longer period of time before they can master it to the level of automaticity. Interestingly enough, too, when they did fMRI studies, the control group had more supplementary motor cortex, so they might have more of a motor planning template when they're writing their letters, and dyslexics looked like they were using their cerebellums more maybe to coordinate the letters in order to master the task. Okay, now I'm very briefly going into math because I know that Vinod is going to be talking about this. Just to introduce the topic, it's been really a wonderful discovery of the different components involved with math knowledge. There's some level, this is a sort of a proposed model for thinking about how the brain learns math, infancy, preschool, and school age. And here in this level, it's ability, brain area, and cognitive representation. The earliest level is perceiving there are more dots here than here. There's a representation of quantity. But later on, as in preschool, when math begins to have to identify numbers and words, that's when you start seeing more left prefrontal activation. Matching numbers and quantities with the Arabic number system often involves bioccipital activation, and then things like the number line involves biparietal areas. If you look at arithmetic, there are more things: concepts, principles, spatial abilities, numerosity. In general, it seems like mathematics is really just also starting to get its stride. There was more activity, I think, in the area of reading, but it's going to be a rich area for understanding and being able to help the students who have these difficulties. So far, some of the studies with developmental dyscalculia have found things like this. When controls are compared to dyscalculics, there's less of activation in the right interparietal sulcus. And if you look at typically developing versus developmental dyscalculics, there's a lot of difference in these areas in the brain when they're trying to do tasks like 9 + 5. You see a lot of difference. This kind of task, which looks very simple when you look on the school level, requires some perception of number quantity, spatial working memory, problem representation, and math facts retrieval. This I wanted to add too. When they looked at low math achieving children and high math achieving children, they also noticed that the higher math achieving students noticed more. Their brains took notice more when they got an answer incorrect. So it had more of an error checking involved with that too. And you have to consider that as the whole person when they're having difficulties with math. Okay, so now I'm getting to writing and dysgraphia. And traditionally, dysgraphia has been a very neglected area in the field of learning disabilities. And yet, there are many children who are extremely distraught and having severe difficulties because of it. 50% of children in university-based psychiatric clinic had dysgraphia or a writing disability. And I want to make a point here, too, about the Wyatt 2 and Wyatt 3, much more sensitive than the Woodcock-Johnson. We see a lot of students who get told that they have nothing wrong with them from the Woodcock-Johnson, but they really are severely impaired with their writing, and often this test is just a more thorough test of understanding why they're having difficulty writing. Writing is a complex task, and so it inevitably takes a lot of children in that category. Some will be dyslexic, but some will have severe working memory, attention issues. It's kind of a final common pathway for a lot of activities in the brain, but it's an important one to think about because it's such a public impairment in the classroom. And when children, a lot of their time is really spent with schoolwork, the writing thing is a huge source of shame, for instance, and embarrassment, and ultimately depression. There have been some early studies, but in Nature, trying to study writing in the fMRI scanner is not an easy task. But there's a very nice study done by Richards and Berninger at the University of Washington, where they're looking at their good writers and poor writers. And what they found, which matches what we observe in the clinic, is the good writers had much more activation of motor sensory areas and cerebellar areas when they were writing letters. The poorer writers had much more occipital activation. There's more visual monitoring. And if you watch children, they're often very closely following their points. And when you see the way they form their letters, they have to monitor which way the pen turns. It's because they don't know where their fingers are going. And so when you think about the working memory demands, if every 5, it has to be visually monitored where you're going, it's going to be easy for you to get lost, forget the nature of the problem. Working memory overload is huge for these students. This is an example of a student with impaired letter writing automaticity. Look at the irregularity in terms of letters. This F and this F look totally different. There's irregular spacing. I'm a neurologist, so I look for pseudochorea. You have them hold their fingers out, close their eyes, and sometimes what you'll see is just a little bit of twitching of the fingers because they don't know where their fingers are in space. If you don't know where your fingers are in space, it makes it harder to write. We gave a talk, and a software engineer said, that's what it is. When I sign my name, I have to consciously think of every letter when I sign my name, otherwise I'll write my name wrong. That's impaired letter writing automaticity. In terms of the neurobiology of dysgraphia and spelling, I wanted to quote William James because some people consider him the father of psychology. And he wrote here, "I am myself a very poor visualizer and find that I can seldom call to mind even a single letter of the alphabet in purely retinal terms. I must trace the letter by running my mental eye over its contour in order that the image of it shall leave any distinctness at all." He was a very good historian. In fact, when they've looked at children with spelling disabilities, it does really require a lot more left hemispheric activation, than reading when they compare these two categories. And it's really under-recognized as a specific learning disability. We often see it in the context in our clinic of dyslexia. Sometimes we refer to it as stealth dyslexia, where the writing parts are worse than the reading, for instance. But it is not a benign condition, as I alluded to in the previous slide. Handwriting and spelling errors were found in 89% of suicide notes left by adolescents. Another really just staggering fact. But I think there are a lot of students who leave school. They're so frustrated by the spelling, and it just makes them feel like they're stupid. This is kind of a busy slide. The only point I wanted to make about it is that there's a lot of complexity. It's not the simple story of, dyslexia is a simple deficit. There's sort of something that's not working, and then we can make it working again. Here, it's looking at orthographic mapping, morphological mapping without phonological shift. It's looking at different types of spelling errors in all these different brain regions. The ones I highlighted were the ones where dyslexics and controls had different patterns of activation. In some cases, for instance, here it was activated on the right in dyslexics, and in the midline for controls, here was bilateral in dyslexics, and here left. So it really is a complicated pattern of differences, and some believe so it's not a simple deficit. It really is wiring changes that underlie it. Address ADD, ADHD, and learning. Learning problems have been formally identified, so ADD, ADHD as a learning disability in the educational system since 1991. And I like this quote from really a wonderful review from Bush at Mass General from 2010 on the neurobiology of attention deficit disorders. "Clearly, a single abnormality of any one region does not cause ADHD." So there you have it. Attention involves different components: selective attention. There's an involvement of motivation, novelty, reward. I'll show you some interesting data in that regard. Executive function, planning, organization, behavioral inhibition, working memory, and attention shifting. So when it comes to sustained attention, these are, here's healthy controls. These are ADHD children who have never received medication. And these are brain slices that go from the base of the brain, the cerebellum, all the way to the top, and similarly over here. And the main pertinent finding I wanted to mention here was the fact that it looks like there's weaker, cerebellum to cerebellum, there's weaker frontostriatal, here's striatal, parietal cerebellar activation in dyslexic children, ADHD children compared to healthy controls. That would be what you would expect for sustained attention. But this is an interesting twist as well, the reward component for ADHD. And in fact, children with ADHD have an enhanced brain activation when a money reward is presented with this continuous performance task. Often the reward is fairly trivial. It says that you get play money, or it says that you get like a smiley face in response to the task. But ADHD children as a group are highly reward sensitive, and you can see that in terms of their brain activation. If you treat them with methylphenidate, it looks as if there's a partial reversal. It's not exact, but it looks like the trend anyway is different. And with treatment, omissions seem to be improved more than commission errors. The default network is also another fascinating story that's occurred on the scene for ADHD. The default network is that network that's activated when you put someone in the scanner and you don't tell them to do anything. So initially everyone was looking to do a particular task, and then actually researchers thought to study what the brain was doing in its resting state. And now we know that the default network is turned down in response to an external task. And so the normal pattern where you're trying to have someone attend, for instance, to do an attention task, to pay attention, sustain attention, the normal functioning of the default network is to turn itself down. And so, these categories, this is ADHD off methylphenidate, ADHD on meds, and then controls here at the bottom. And the first striking finding that they found is that when you compare controls to ADHD off medication, is that ADHD students don't turn down the default network. So it's as if you're keeping in that sort of daydreaming network and you're not attending to the task. But the interesting thing, well, there's a couple interesting things, is under high incentive situations for completing a task, there actually really is more activation. See here, the worm colors show that it's more active compared to controls. But under high incentive, actually, it looks here as if it's even more turned down than in the controls. When medications are tried, what you can see is that there's more inhibition of the default network on medications. So this reward aspect is certainly an interesting part of understanding ADHD. Okay, so finally we get to some unresolved issues, but they're also fascinating in and of themselves. I think, and this is an opportunity for all of you out there to better delineate the core features of reading disability, math disability, writing disability, and ADHD are currently undergoing revision for the DSM-5 and the source of a lot of debate and controversy. We could have an entire symposium on that. The question of how broad to diagnose, how narrow, where disease occurs, where trait begins, how to do assessments. Comprehensive assessments, seem like a good thing, but they can't be implemented on a broad scale for screening, seeing as it is such a common problem. And also finding some match between medical and educational definitions is a huge challenge that we all face. I'd also like to talk in the last few slides I have about the effect of individual factors such as IQ and developmental variations on phenotype. I think that's also a rich area, and it's perfect for this audience. And finally, neurodiversity, discussing strengths as well as weaknesses. Okay, to start off this section, I wanted to quote from Hippocrates. It is more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of a disease a person has. There's a lot of wisdom in this because your patient is the patient who walks in the door, and so these general categories do start to blur because you take care of whatever shows up. It's okay. Okay, great. What I want to show here is IQ and normal cortical development. This showed a surprising finding with cortical thickness. This is average. High IQ in prefrontal areas, this is age. Initially, it was thought that if you had high IQ, you would have greater cortical thickness. There's this general trend in pruning over time. That's what you're seeing with the down curving slopes. But what shocked people is that the superior high IQ group, which is over 120, had this really late bloom, and in fact had much thinner cortex than the average IQ and superior IQ. They ended up topping the curves at this age, but they didn't actually cross until around 11 or 12 years old. So there was this late blooming presentation for high IQ children. It's interesting because there's a high overlap between, this is gifted overexcitabilities list, this is mostly in the gifted education literature, and the DSM-4. I'll just do a couple of them: active and energetic, often on the go, rapid speech, talks excessively, intense physical activity, fidget, squirms. There's a lot of overlap between gifted checklists and ADHD checklists. And in fact, there's some evidence that a diffuse attention, this is a Harvard study, correlates with higher creativity among the high IQ. If you look at diffuse attention and high degrees of creativity, then diffuse attention is much higher with high creative achievement than focused attention. The model used here is latent inhibition, which has subjects study a particular stimulus and then gives them an incidental stimulus. Individuals with diffuse attention will notice it even though it's not on task. Okay, the question is, how does high IQ and ADHD affect attention? In fact, students with ADHD and high IQ seem to have less omission and commission errors on the continuous performance task. So to some extent, high IQ may compensate for a sustained attention task like the CPT. However, high IQ does not fully compensate for working memory, and 74% of high IQ ADHD children had at least one standard deviation discrepancy between their verbal scores and working memory. 40% had a 2 standard deviation discrepancy. High IQ also does not fully compensate for processing speed challenges in ADHD. 80% had at least one standard deviation discrepancy, much higher than the standard sample. In terms of looking at developmental brain trajectories, high IQ students with ADHD by checklist criteria don't show the developmental lag of low IQ students with ADHD. This is from our own clinic. We're looking at high IQ and working memory. Mainly to show you here, these are composite scores from the WISC. Verbal Comprehension Index, we see some very high IQ children. And what it shows you is this downward trend here is processing speed is often most severely affected, working memory as well, but actually verbal and perceptual reasoning indices are quite strong. Again, these are the scores too. You can see there are certain sweet spots that are good for our high IQ dyslexic students, listening comprehension, oral expression, but much weaker are things like pseudoword naming and oral reading accuracy. Writing in general as a trend is really not well compensated by the high IQ, and so it's often the bane of students with dyslexia regardless of high IQ. Okay. Just to show you, here are examples of high IQ students from our clinic who had really quite severe, there's this reversal writing challenges here. Someone wanted to write an F and it came out as a K, and this student had an IQ of 150 and did the letter G where J should have been. There are visual spatial skills in dyslexia that are weaker and also stronger. Some of the data I'm presenting here, the dyslexics are stronger with spatial learning, but they're actually weaker with visual search. Dyslexics can perform better with rotational tasks. Spatial problem solving, dyslexics are actually stronger on certain creative and spatial insight problems. Divergent thinking tasks as a group. In this one study, dyslexics actually came up with more alternative uses and were able to generate more pictures. Something to keep in mind, because the students that you see are often really dragged down by the school system. If they have trouble with reading and writing, they often have to spend more time reading and writing, and so they're overwhelmed by what they can't do. I love this slide because it talks about divergent thinking. I won't read it in the interest of time, but it's a mother talking about her son and how many different possibilities he thought of when he heard cat. And it's a perfect example of divergent thinking. It can be a source of creativity and incredible innovation, but it also can cause a lot of problems in the early years. And this last slide, just to show you that this is a task. You're supposed to silently generate a verb associated with a noun. So they gave you boat, and people could think of sailing. The red areas are just control brains, and the blue areas just dyslexic brains. Look at the differences that are present. This is not a simple condition. They're very different patterns of activation and different wiring. I think that's. Did I make my time? Mm-hmm. So, thank you very much.
We can take a couple of questions if anyone has any questions.
I'd like to add that we have a free network, Dyslexic Advantage. It's one of the world's largest online community for dyslexic families as well as dyslexia professionals. And I'd encourage you to join if you are interested.
With the population you come in with the learning problems, anecdotally, how many of them tend to have ADHD? Is it common for you to see, or is it what's your experience?
So what's the incidence of ADHD? We have a private practice, and I'd have to say that the numbers are influenced by the fact that some parents really don't want to take the checklist. I mean, it's, it might be, so I don't know that that's a good value. It seems like there's a high overlap. It's a high overlap. And so I think it's pretty hard to estimate, but I think there are a lot of students who might have been checked for ADHD but not checked for dyslexia. Question?
Yeah, I mean, if you're seeing virtually no difference between ADHD, LD, in the reading of on neuropsychological testing, if that's the conclusion to me would be they're the same disorder based on the neuropsychological test. The imaging suggests it's different. So what's the value of the neuropsychological tests for a kid who has ADHD and LD? And to a broader point, what's the evidence that it's not just a broad phenotype?
These are great questions. I think the question is if there's not much of a neuropsychological difference, then what's the point of doing the test? In our situation, because we have the practice that we do, if we find a weak area, for instance, if we find working memory or sentence repetition or writing problems, or word decoding problems, then we actually make recommendations for what would help. When I actually trained at UCSF, there was I think it was called a Fishmanism, neurologists diagnose and adios. And what I've tried to do is not do that. And for that reason, what was helped in our clinic is we saw a lot of gifted students, and a lot of cases they would tell us they're very metacognitive. They would tell us how they perform certain tasks. You can do visual memory tasks and have no visual memory if you verbally describe it. So I think things like that, if you really use the neuropsychological testing to understand in detail what the nature of the problem is, I think you can help tremendously. And I got to say, MDs, this is a great field for you guys. So I do hope that you consider working in the learning field.
Do you want to take one more question?
One more, yeah, sure.
How important do you think it is to figure out specifically what the problem is? What I've been running into with schools is they'll see that the child isn't learning to read, and then they have a next step where they teach all the children in the same way to read again. And it seems like, you've got to fail about 4 or 5 times before they even think about looking at where the specific problem is.
Yeah, so the question is what's the difference, the gap between what you see, what you recommend, and also, for instance, what the school can implement if there's no change. I mean, we see some incredibly awesome parents that are totally into doing whatever it takes. Some cases, if it's really familial, and if, say, for instance, the mother has dyslexia and she says, I cannot do this. I wish I could help, but reading's tough for me. Then we try to put her in touch with a tutor or try to talk to the teacher. But there are some parents who really will do whatever it takes. And so that means they'll do extra tutoring. They'll actually do more multisensory strategies. In many cases, it's often not perceiving certain similar sounds. And so being able to relate that, accentuate it, clap it out, exaggerate it, come up with a little memory trick often really helps tremendously. I mean, I had a student who said, world, oh, that's that hard word to spell because there's a silent R. And you're thinking, uh-oh, it's not a silent R because he's hearing world as the same thing as world. And so there's a lot of these perceptual errors that underlie these learning differences, and it is great to have physicians that are involved with making the diagnosis. You can help tremendously just conceptualizing it so they know where to begin to help.
We'll have more time at the end for discussion.